conversation. Let me just respond specifically to what the points Tom's making and try to translate them into what I'm worried about. How do consequences matter in interpretive theory if you assume that the constitutional plan delegates to future generations? The question of how you think about consequences has to be decided by the generation that's doing the work. Right? This is the whole idea of the delegation. It's not that you know in advance what the best consequences are. If you knew what the best consequences are, you could just say, this is the rule we're going to apply. The implicit idea of delegation is that each generation has to figure out what the best thing is, and they have to build out a lattice work of doctrine and practices to promote it. They will be delegated also the question of what things matter in judging what the best consequences are. So to just take an example, we face a very, this is Tom Lee's paper, we face a very different foreign policy set of problems than we did in 1789. And the technologies of war are different, and the strategies are different. And we have to figure out what's the national interest today, and we also have to figure out how to connect that national interest with existing traditions of civil liberties and so forth, right? That has to be a delegation of the present. And if there's one thing, John, you and I agree on, it's that. Even though John often talks in terms of originalism, in fact, I read him as basically taking a very contemporary judgment about how to conduct foreign policy given American traditions. And I don't agree with historical conclusions, but I think we agree on that point. So that's an example. I mean, the foreign policy example is a great example where we think about it. I mean, Tom's paper is an example of saying, you know what, actually the weak state model actually works better for today for reasons which are very complicated. But you're going to talk about this later on. Okay. As to the question of how can I agree with Larry Alexander and reject purposivism, the answer is that Larry's making an important point about how language works and how minds use language to work. It's a basic philosophical point. He says that when we see language and we want to use it in form of communication, it's necessary for us to attribute a mind which intended something. And I agree with Larry's basic philosophical point. I don't know whether we have a dispute, but if there was a dispute, which I'm not sure there is, it would be what ways do we have to construct intention in order to do the work of legal interpretation? What gets put in and what gets left out, and that's a more complicated question. The way in which this article uses intent is we assume that there were people who created law. They deliberately used language in a certain way. We should try to ascribe to them the intention that makes sense of why they would choose particular forms of language they did, technologies of language they did. And so intention is not, you can't get rid of the idea of intention from interpretation. But purposiveness could mean a different question, which is that when we try to give an account of how the structures of the Constitution are supposed to work, we try to ascribe a purpose to those structures. So, for example, to take, for example, foreign policy, constitutionalism is on my mind right now, you might say one structural goal here is to make it difficult to get into war and easy to get out of war. Right? That's not in the text. That's a statement of purpose that would be part of a construction about how we thought about the separation of powers between the President and the Senate. It's also tied to the idea of treating the Constitution as a plan for politics. And one theme of this chapter is the idea, which is taken from Scott Shapiro's forthcoming book, of trying to think about constitutions as being like plans, very incomplete plans. Now, Scott's offering a general theory of law. I'm not offering a general theory of law. I'm offering a political theory of constitutions, and the plan metaphor is actually a very useful one for that purpose. Whether or not you buy the planning theory for law generally, it's actually pretty useful for thinking about constitutions. And planning theory assumes that there is a plan, that which requires intention, which requires design and purpose, all of these, mental metaphors. And so you act as if, in fact, there is a design or purpose and you're trying to fulfill it. You put yourself on the side of it, and you see yourself as trying to achieve it. Now, other people who disagree with you in interpretation will say that's not what the point of the plan is. That's not what they designed. And then you get into a scuffle. But the scuffle is between people who think that what they're trying to do is actualize and realize the plan for politics in history. And when they try to actualize and realize it, they inevitably will bring their notions of consequences, their notions of what's just, their notions of purpose into the fracas. That is why I suspect your point about the slide from the faithful agent model into the welfarist model, I think, is a perfectly plausible concern. Because how is it that people later on, each claiming to be, right, here's the plan, here's how we're going forward, here's how to implement it, it'll turn out that often their disputes can be cashed out in terms of what look like welfarist consequences. But the question is, does that make them welfarist theories? And that's a question we have to think about, how we characterize different kinds of theories. How many minutes do I have left? 2.5. 2.5. Okay, good. All right. I myself, part of the whole discussion of David Strauss, you should understand, is not to deny the value of common law constitutionalism as a mode of articulation or construction, but rather it's to defeat the following claim, which is a claim made by many non-originalists. And this is the claim. There's nothing that the Constitution says in the text that we're really ultimately bound by. That the text ultimately imposes no significant constraint on us because the text is just a jumping off point. That is, fidelity to the Constitution does not require at base fidelity to original meaning. The reason why is because fidelity to a plan or to a project over time doesn't really require that there be any single thing that remains constant over time. It could be like Noah's boat. Noah's boat metaphor is that as they repair the boat, as the boat is floating, and so by the time they get to their destination, there's no original piece of the boat left, right? So the argument that a non-originalist might make is a constitution as a project is just like that boat, right? So if you're an originalist of the kind, like this is Larry Solem's take on what the irreducible component of originalism is, you can't buy that theory. There has to be something that stays constant over time while everything else is changing around it. So the reason for the discussion of David Strauss is to refute that claim that a constitutional plan is like that kind of boat. And the way I do that is by suggesting that there are certain relatively fixed features of the text that current practice would not regard as being fair rules of interpretation in the game. And so that's the whole point of that. On the other hand, when we get into what Larry calls construction zone, we might well use some version of common law constitutionalism, and many of the things that David says makes perfect sense to me. Which then brings me to this final point, which is relevant. It has to do with a paper that Andrew Cohn wrote recently. And Andrew's basic claim is that originalists make an illegitimate claim that certain forms of irreducible originalism are just what interpretation is. It's by sort of stipulative definition. Now, I get that, and I'm not a stipulative definition kind of guy. So let me just tell you where my sense of it is. I'm trying to give an account of a set of historical practices of what's considered fair game in interpretive and constructive moves. I, however, am enough of an historicist to know that if you go back in history into a different culture and a different time, there are different forms of interpretive moves that are considered completely legitimate that we would consider completely illegitimate today. And the example is when I was growing up, and they made me study Talmud. And when you study Talmud, you're permitted to count the numerical equivalents of the letters in a Hebrew word. And if you can find a numerical equivalent of that word to another word, then you can read that word as the equivalent, right? And that is a textual move. It is considered faithful to the original meaning, and it is perfectly legitimate. Okay, so I can't say that this particular form of original meaning, originalism, is just what interpretation is. It's just historically not accurate, culturally not accurate. You know the Pomo sides of me. I just can't buy that. On the other hand, I can make a very historically grounded claim about a particular tradition of Anglo-American thinking about how to use texts and how to control politics and construct politics through the use of text. And within that tradition, my claim is certain kinds of moves with text are considered out of bounds. But someone might come back and say the following, but Jack, are you telling me that someday American constitutional understandings might move toward gematria, right? Americans might actually start doing sort of biblical code style stuff, and that would be okay, right? And I'd say, well, maybe, but I certainly won't support it, and that's for the future to decide. But I'm trying to give a sympathetic account of our current practices. Okay.